Hi, everyone. Hope you had a great week. I am re-recording the video. Something happened with the upload, which is why I didn't go through last night. So I'm re-recording and I'll get this posted and sent out for you today. If you see me looking away, I'm looking at a different screen because I'm not at my usual setup. Okay, so let's jump right in and start with a quick review of week 2, and then we'll jump right into week 3. Okay, so last week was History Social Science Framework Chapter 1, the introduction, and then we began work on the C3 framework. We have pages 5 through 7, then 11 through 21, and then tons of other resources for you to check out. So if you remember history, or chapter 1, introduce us to the framework and really set the stage for what the history social science framework really meant for us, not only in elementary, but all the way through secondary. And one of the most important things is, the diversity of California, and not just in students, but cultures, language, economics, small school districts, large school districts, rural, urban, K-12 districts, elementary districts. So there's such a variation in the state. So it's really important to understand the overall framework, but then to remember that it's important to understand your local context when you're developing lessons and activities for students. And then there was the C3 framework. With some of the key emphasis on not just on content knowledge, but also on developing literacy, having students explore through informative questions, how we communicate, how they're able to evaluate data, understand sources, primary sources, secondary sources, really because we want them to be informed participants in college, in their career, and in civic life in general. Okay, so we'll jump right into week 3 real quick. As a reminder, the navigation menu in Brightspace. My menu go. Navigation menu in Brightspace has all the assignments for each week. And normally Sundays we'll have this video posted, but technical difficulties will get this out to you today on Monday. So week 3, we're going to explore primary sources and integrating literacy. So we'll have our readings, we'll have a journal entry this week, we'll have our exit ticket, and there's your first lesson plan that's going to be due this week. That is a meaning-making lesson using primary sources. This is an excellent one. Love this lesson plan. So in week 3, I do want you to take some time to familiarize yourself with the media arts standards. But a lot of the reading is going to be on chapter 21, instructional strategies. This is going to be really important. And so as you're reading through the instructional strategies, there are strategies appropriate for elementary, middle grades, and high school. And also there is an article, Teaching with Primary Sources. And so when we're thinking about primary sources, there's a document I'm going to share with you, really the difference between primary sources and secondary sources. Primary sources being journal entries, letters, maps, things that were created by people during the time period that we're studying. Secondary sources, documentaries, biographies, created afterwards based on those sources. Textbook, for instance, is a secondary source, but within the textbook you'll have primary sources. So you'll open a history textbook and you'll have Washington's Farewell Address, which is the primary source. You'll have maps showing Lewis and Clark's Exposition, which is a primary source. But the overall textbook is a secondary source that contains very relevant primary source documents. Tons of really great learning resources as well. Spotlight on the California standards for media arts, super important. Handful of you created your exit tickets and other activities using media. recording yourself, which is a way to really practice. And once you get comfortable with using these other sources or technologies, be able to teach them with your students. And then there's some other great resources: Getty Museum, World History Encyclopedia. The second to last one there, teaching difficult topics with primary sources. So it's interesting, in certain communities you have textbooks or other materials that are primary sources where the community feels like, oh my gosh, is this appropriate for this age group? So you want to be mindful of that appropriateness of materials. Also, materials depicting the brutalization and treatment of enslaved Africans, because some of those are graphic and brutal, and really show the brutality of that period in our American history, the treatment of indigenous cultures. So there's a lot of things, primary sources, that you really want to not censor, but really just be mindful of age appropriateness when you're sharing those sources. This 6-minute YouTube video shows an example of engaging kindergarten students in analyzing primary sources. Yes, kindergartners can analyze primary sources, so this is a great 6-minute video for you to check out. Okay, so chapter 21 of the History and Social Science Standards, the emphasis is really on discipline-specific skills. So in history, reading, interpreting primary and secondary sources, writing historical arguments. So that is in history. Then it also covers geography. So in geography, it's using geographic representations, analysis of the technologies to make reasoned decisions. So you have history, social science, or history in particular, geography, and then there's some, it's going to talk about some across-discipline strategies, metacognition, thinking about your thinking, thinking about your learning, connecting students, learning to really today's events, and really getting them to understand that today's events are tomorrow's history. It's also going to have some strategies on use of text and varied sources. So in your history classroom or in your elementary classroom that has history resources, that you are including a broad variety of texts, primary sources, maps, textbooks, newspapers, literature, blogs. So it's not just the history textbook as your only source. In chapter 3 or in chapter 21, it also encourages you to really reinforce that your students should be engaged in reading, writing, speaking, listening, and interpreting visuals. And those are all integrated into this discipline-based instruction. So it's not just reading the chapters in the book and answering the questions. It's speaking, having students engage in academic discourse and academic conversations in class, listening and retelling, listening and analyzing, listening and interpreting, and of course writing. And visual interpretations. What do you see here when you see this image of I was going to say political cartoons, but really only after about age 8 or 9 can students really get into some abstract thinking. So be careful with political cartoons, because they can be so abstract that if students are really still in that concrete stage, it's going to be difficult for them to interpret, understand, analyze the meaning of political cartoons, not until they get at least past, at the very earliest, age 8, but before that they're really at this concrete operational stage. Let's head back to your psychology classes. So, okay, I'm back. That was weird. Had to step away real quick. Okay. One of the resources in week 3 is how to notate content standards and ELD standards. So when you click on the links in Brightspace for week 3, there's some hyperlinks there. There's 2 hyperlinks to open separate documents on how to cite your standards in your lesson plan. So make sure you're following that naming and numbering convention, and so begin using the following, the template in your daily practice. For example, like by the end of the week, by the end of the lesson, students will be able to identify the major goals of the Lewis and Clark exposition as measured by the end of the unit test. By the end of the unit, students will be able to compare and contrast the different stages of the scientific process by creating a visual graphic organizer showing these comparisons. By the end of the lesson, students will be able to write an essay explaining the conflicts between the antagonist and protagonist as measured by the rubric. So that's kind of the standard formula. It's also, if you are a special educator or are writing goals for an IEP, there's going to be a regular flow to how you write your goals and objectives, that they're measurable. So primary sources. One of my absolute favorite parts about teaching history. So primary sources, original materials created during the time under study or by the participants directly involved. So diaries, letters, speeches, photographs, artifacts, government records, surveys, interviews, field notes, original data sets. So primary sources are going to be those original materials created during the time that you're studying or by participants directly involved. So during the time or after the time. So letters written or an account of the Battle of Gettysburg written by soldiers from the North and the South, and you're reading both of those. So primary sources. Secondary sources. The difference being that these are interpretations or analyses based on the primary sources or other research. And they're often used to explain the contextual events, people, and ideas from the past. Textbooks, biographies, documentaries, scholarly articles, research reviews. And so there are some strengths. Provides context, which is important, but it may include author's bias. So strengths and limitations for each. So you're relying on somebody else's interpretation of what they read. So identifying the bias and being able to inform students of any potential bias in any of the primary sources. For example, it's interesting because the cartoon, the famous Boston Massacre cartoon that we see of redcoats firing upon colonists in the square, it's a primary source because it happened at the time, but as you read and research, it does not represent what actually happened. So that is one other limitation of primary source. We look at it and say, oh wow, this happened during the time, it must be true. Not always. So providing our students with the skills and abilities to determine the validity of or reliability of documents. Okay, so our meaning making lesson. There's a hyperlink for the full assignment description in Brightspace. Meaning making is a term used by the California Department of Ed in the framework to mean reading comprehension. Meaning making should be the central purpose for interacting with text, which is important to really understand, make meaning of what is written. For the lesson, select a primary source, speech, political cartoon, diary entry, map, photo, etc., related to your topic. and write a lesson plan integrating content knowledge and higher order thinking using the reading comprehension standards. So let's say I already mentioned Washington's farewell address, primary source. The lesson, be able to describe what George Washington was cautioning our young nation against as he left office. Cite specific examples from the speech and connect it to current events, or is what he's saying relevant today? That's maybe middle school, older elementary school. Or a map. Based on the location of rivers and bodies of water, what is the ideal location for settlers to live? Provide at least 3 examples as to why you selected such and such based on the lesson on geography. So it's the primary source is going to be the basis of the lesson. They look at a map, they read a speech. Again, I caution you against political cartoons if they are too young, just because they still may be in that concrete operational stage and not really be able to understand abstract thinking. So that is the primary source lesson. Where to find the full directions. So use the link in the week 3 overview, to access the full directions. It also includes a link to some strong examples of finished assignments from past students. And as a reminder, begin thinking about your week 7 fieldwork assignment. Attend a performance, visit a local art exhibit, a potential field trip site, a museum, a cultural event. Interview a potential guest speaker or presenter, or attend an art class or workshop. So your prep time is also included in that 5 hours. You don't have to go to something for 5 hours, but typically if you're going to go visit a museum, you're going to spend at least a couple of hours there, a couple hours writing up your final project. Exit ticket. 3 things you learned, 2 things you want to try, and 1 helpful point from this week video. I'll be sending out this week a Calendly link for you to select a date for our 15 to 20 minute one-on-one meeting. So be on the lookout for that. That's it. That's all I got. Apologize for missing office hours last week. Got home, went to change the filter in our HVAC unit and smelled gas, and the guy came out. Sure enough, there was 3 gas leaks, 1 at the cooktop, 1 at the furnace, and then 1 outside at the meter. He said we're at no risk of blowing ourselves up, but you hear horror stories. Call, text, email if you need anything. Have a great week, everybody, and I'll be sending out an email for our one-on-one meetings. Take care.